At 7:12 in the morning, a chainsaw choir and 3 post-hole diggers serenaded Claudia Pinner's mimosa brunch. Her guests dressed in their Sunday best with pastel cardigans and pearl earrings hovered over kitsch, while my surveyor spray-painted neon orange dots across what she called her lower lawn and what the county GIS called the lake parcel I had just bought. The dots formed a perfect line, bisecting her carefully manicured grass like a mathematical truth she couldn't argue with. The first cedar post went in with a satisfying thunk, dead center between her matching Adirondack chairs. I could hear the outraged gasps from 30 feet away. Claudia's mimosa sloshed as she lunged for her phone and dialed 911, wailing with theatrical panic in her voice, claiming I was fencing through her backyard and destroying her property. I waved cheerfully from the shoreline, holding my county-stamped survey documents high in the air, and yelled back that I was fencing through her encroachment, not her backyard, and that words matter. Her face turned a shade of red that matched her decorative throw pillows. I'm Luca Merritt, a web developer whose hobbies include silence, reading manuals other people ignore, and meticulously documenting things with timestamps and photographs. I bought a small private lake called Mallet Pond, technically a spring-fed kettle lake with its own parcel ID and tax bill adjacent to Willow Point Meadows, an HOA that believed the pond was their personal mood board and community gathering space. The previous owner had been an elderly man who lived out of state and never visited. So, the HOA had simply claimed the lake through sheer audacity and repetition. Nobody challenged them because nobody cared enough until I showed up with a deed and an opinion. Enter Claudia Pinner, HOA president for 6 consecutive years, Pilates instructor at the community center, and collector of grudges that she cataloged like vintage wines. She had been treating my shoreline like a community amenity for years. Yoga mats arranged on the cattails every Tuesday and Thursday morning. Wine nights on a floating dock decorated with fairy lights that she somehow powered with an extension cord running across my property. Mindful cannonballs from teenagers who left energy drink cans bobbing in the shallows. Her own grandchildren had birthday parties on what she called the community beach, which was actually just a cleared section of my lake shore that she had mulched without permission. When the deed officially changed hands to me, I posted polite signs within 48 hours. They read private lake access by permit only and included my contact information for anyone who wanted to discuss legitimate access. I even used a friendly font. Claudia tore them down within 6 hours and personally hand-delivered a compliance notice to my mailbox demanding I restore community use or pay a $500 impact fee for disrupting neighborhood harmony. The notice was printed on HOA letterhead. She had clearly designed herself, complete with a clip art gavel. I framed it and hung it in my home office as a conversation piece. Claudia escalated with the grace of a goose on rollerblades and the subtlety of a car alarm at midnight. She issued violations for my hostile typography, which was apparently just the font on my signs. Times New Roman, if you're curious. Too aggressive, she claimed. She also cited me for my aggressive shoreline posture, which was actually 2 large decorative boulders I had professionally placed to block adverses from tearing up the wetland vegetation. According to her violation notice, the boulders created a hostile visual barrier that disrupted the natural flow of community access. The boulders weighed 800 pounds each and cost me $200 to install. They weren't going anywhere. Then she started spying, and I mean that literally. Binoculars from her deck at all hours. I'd wave, and she'd duck behind a planter like I couldn't see her. Drone flights at dawn that hovered over my property until I started documenting them with timestamps and filing FAA complaints. A motion-activated wildlife camera mounted on a tree that was technically on HOA common ground, but angled squarely at my dock. The wildlife it captured was me drinking coffee in my bathrobe, me checking my phone, and me once flipping off the camera when I finally spotted it. She printed that photo and tried to fine me for obscene gestures on community visible property. My attorney sent her a letter explaining that my lake and my dock were not community visible property, and that her camera was arguably stalking. Rumors bloomed around the neighborhood like algae in warm water. Luca was draining the lake to build a mega mansion. Luca was stockpiling alligators for some unspecified nefarious purpose. Luca hated children and amphibians with equal passion. One neighbor asked me in the grocery store if it was true I was planning to turn the lake into a toxic waste dump. I told her no. I was just planning to own the lake I had purchased, which apparently made me a villain. Then came the HOA newsletter, a glossy 4-page color masterpiece that must have cost a fortune to print. Page 3 declared that effective immediately, Willow Point members retain grandfathered rights to Mallard Pond for recreation, fishing, dock maintenance, and quote, peaceful enjoyment, unquote. Grandfathered from what? Claudia's imagination. There was no historical easement, no previous agreement, nothing in the chain of title, just vibes and entitlement. Finally, the peace resistance arrived. A printed community map, professionally bound and distributed to every household, showed their property line as a generous, bulging hug around the lake, swallowing 20 feet of my parcel like a donut bites the whole. My lake was drawn as if it were nestled inside HOA boundaries. Claudia had literally redrawn reality with a graphics program and presented it as fact. That was the moment I decided to stop being polite. So, I pulled the official plat from the county, hired a licensed surveyor with credentials longer than my arm, and discovered some absolutely delicious facts. Claudia's lower lawn, the one she had landscaped with imported river rock and decorative grasses, was a landscape bed built 6 feet onto my lake parcel. Not 6 feet, complete with a tiki bar that had a permit application listing her address, a trampoline teetering on rip-rap that definitely violated setback requirements, and 3 solar-powered garden lights that technically made it a permanent structure. Also, her unpermitted floating dock sprouted 3 feet beyond the ordinary high water mark into state-protected wetlands. She had driven pylons into a kettle lake without an Army Corps of Engineers permit. Adorable. My surveyor photographed everything, marked the actual boundaries with GPS precision, and gave me a report that was basically a legal loaded gun. I kept it in a fireproof safe and smiled every time I thought about it. Claudia called a special enforcement warning, which is how I found her on my shore at 7:15 a.m. in a sash that said chair in glittery iron-on letters, flanked by 2 board members wearing matching HOA polo shirts, and a man with a GoPro mounted on a chest rig like he was documenting a polar expedition. She marched onto my shore, her wedge sandals sinking into the soft ground, and tacked up an HOA order with a staple gun. The order demanded I remove the fence within 72 hours, restore the community easement that didn't exist, and pay a $250 per day fine starting immediately. I informed her calmly, while my own phone recorded video, that there was no recorded easement in the county system and that her order had no legal standing. She turned to the GoPro and announced with dramatic emphasis that I was hostile, uncooperative, and a threat to community harmony. Then she pulled out her phone and dialed 911 for the second time that morning. But this time she added creative spice to her story, claiming I had threatened to electrify the fence and harm children. I had not. Also, electrified fences are not legal in residential areas. Also, who even thinks of that? Deputies arrived within 12 minutes, glanced at the deeds I had organized in a labeled folder, and asked a perfectly reasonable question about whether this body of water was under an HOA or belonged to a private owner. I handed over my deed with a raised county seal, the official plat map with highlighted boundaries, and the surveyor's report complete with photographs and GPS coordinates. Claudia handed over a newsletter printed on cardstock, a Canva diagram that looked like a child's art project, and a cloth tote bag full of cookies labeled board snacks with a Sharpie. She actually thought cookies would help. The deputies explained they weren't land court and couldn't adjudicate property disputes, but they could confirm that a fence on my parcel built to code and on my land was not a criminal act. Claudia's face went from red to purple as she realized she was losing. So she tried a new angle, her voice rising to a pitch that startled a nearby heron. "Environmental violation," she shrieked. "He's harming a protected wetland. He's destroying habitat." The deputies looked at each other, shrugged, and radioed County Environmental because that was technically outside their scope. That decision changed everything. County Environmental showed up with clipboards, water testing kits, and a man named Derek, who had been enforcing wetland regulations for 20 years and had exactly zero patience for nonsense. Derek took one look at the shoreline and immediately radioed Fish and Wildlife because what he saw was way outside his pay grade. Fish and Wildlife arrived with cameras, measuring tapes, and citation pads already in hand. They photographed her unpermitted floating dock, the cut cattails where she had cleared vegetation for better beach access, her tiki bar sitting on fill material that had never been approved, and a suspicious chemical sheen on the water where someone, guess who, had been over-fertilizing the lower lawn that wasn't even hers. Derek from Environmental took water samples and found phosphate levels 3 times higher than acceptable for a kettle lake. The fertilizer runoff was literally feeding algae blooms. Claudia tried to blame me. I had owned the property for 6 weeks and hadn't put down a single granule of anything. The evidence pointed directly at her pristine chemically enhanced lawn. The room temperature, or rather shoreline temperature, changed dramatically. The environmental officer wrote up Claudia for shoreline vegetation destruction and a stormwater runoff violation. Fish and Wildlife measured her dock, photographed her tiki bar, and asked for permits. She produced a laminated yoga schedule. They produced citation pads. The county surveyor, a different crew from mine, planted official rebar caps along the line. Surprise! My new fence posts were spot on. Claudia's lawn ornaments were not. A deputy explained criminal trespass in small, slow words and advised Claudia that issuing fines to a non-member and tearing down my signs were both problems. I filed a harassment and nuisance complaint and a civil claim for encroachment and timber trespass. Those cattails count. The phrase statutory damages landed like a wet oar. The HOA held an emergency lakeside meeting 3 days later that turned into community theater with paperwork and plot twists. Residents arrived expecting revolution, armed with their own opinions about property rights and community values. They got reality instead. Served cold with official documentation. Claudia had set up a podium and a microphone like she was hosting a press conference. She started with a speech about unity and tradition that lasted 6 minutes before the county official, a patient woman named Maria, interrupted and asked to read from the official record. Maria stood up and read aloud in a clear, carrying voice. Mallet Pond is fee simple private property owned by Luca Merritt, parcel ID 74-38-00002, with no recorded easements, no historical use agreements, and no legal claims in favor of Willow Point Meadows HOA or its members. The meeting went silent except for the sound of Claudia's breathing, which had become audible and slightly wheezy. Then Fish and Wildlife took the microphone and announced a mandatory restoration plan. Remove Claudia Penner's floating dock and all associated structures by the end of the month. Deconstruct the unpermitted tiki bar and remove all fill material from the shoreline. Replant native vegetation, including cattails and button bush in areas where vegetation was cleared. Install silt socks and erosion control barriers on the slope to prevent further nutrient runoff. All at the personal expense of Claudia Penner, as the work was done on property she does not own without permits she did not obtain. The crowd murmured. Someone whispered that this was better than cable television. The deputies, who had stayed for the show, played back Claudia's 911 call on a portable speaker where she had clearly embellished the electrified fence story and claimed I had threatened violence. The recording echoed across the lakeside. You could hear her voice, shrill and certain, making claims that simply were not true. The sheriff's department representative explained that filing a false police report was a misdemeanor, and Claudia Penner was being issued a citation with a mandatory court appearance. Claudia sat down hard on a folding chair and stared at her lap. Meanwhile, my attorney, a sharp woman named Patricia, who had clearly been enjoying this case, sent the HOA board a neat packet via certified mail that she also handed out in printed copies at the meeting. It contained a cease and desist order with very specific language about harassment and defamation, an invoice for damages, including destroyed signs, surveying costs, legal fees, and compensation for the unauthorized use of my property, and a license agreement offering Willow Point residents limited fishing access by permit. The terms were reasonable. Sign a liability waiver, follow posted hours from dawn to dusk, no glass containers, no motors, catch and release only, and respect all posted boundaries. It was more generous than she deserved. But I'm not a monster. The board minus Claudia voted in front of everyone to accept it unanimously. Everyone except Claudia, who stood up and voted never with such vehemence that spittle flew from her mouth. She declared that she would fight this until her last breath, that she would appeal to the state, that she would organize a recall, that she would, and then she stopped talking because the board secretary, a retired paralegal named Gordon, announced that the board had also scheduled a motion to remove Claudia Penner as president for cause. The cause being misuse of HOA funds for personal legal disputes, misrepresentation of HOA authority, filing false violations, and behavior unbecoming an officer. The motion required a 2-3 majority. It passed with 5 votes in favor and 0 against. Claudia had been so busy voting never on the license agreement that she forgot to vote on her own removal. The GoPro guy, bless his suburban documentary heart, recorded the entire vote and Claudia's face as it happened. He uploaded the video to the neighborhood Facebook group that night with captions and timestamps. It got 400 views in 2 hours. The county fined Claudia $1,800 for the unpermitted dock and structures. Fish and Wildlife fined her $2,200 for wetland destruction and violation of state environmental protections. The HOA's errors and omissions insurance reviewed the case and determined they would not cover sovereign vibes, imaginary easements, or decisions made in bad faith by officers acting outside their authority. So, she paid personally all $4,000 plus the estimated $9,000 for the mandatory restoration work. The false police report charge resulted in a $500 fine, 200 hours of community service, and a misdemeanor on her record. She tried to plea bargain. The prosecutor said no. The judge, apparently tired of frivolous calls tying up emergency services, made an example of her. Claudia Penner sat in that courtroom and listened to the judge explain that her behavior wasted resources and endangered real emergencies. And then he added the community service hours specifically as a lake cleanup volunteer wearing a vest that said Shoreline Steward Non-Enforcement. She has to work under fish and wildlife supervision, picking up trash along public waterways, while wearing high-visibility yellow and a badge of her own shame. When the judge read the sentence, Claudia's mouth opened, but no sound came.